Thank you so much for joining us today for the program. It's our honor to bring you the distinguished artist, Charly Palmer. He is a resident of Atlanta, but he has roots in Alabama, and welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Where are your roots?
I was born in a small town in Alabama called Fed. My mother was born there, my father was born just outside of there. And so I spent the first 4 years of my life in Alabama.
How does it feel to be back?
I have always, rooted. I was here and always an Alabama boy, and always, as I was growing up, wanted to come back, but had to figure out how I could make a living in Alabama, in the South. So it's a pleasure to be back home, you know. And I live in Georgia right now, but that's as much home now as anything. But it still has the same feeling. Every place I drive, it kind of reminds me of the memories I had. Because every year, since I was a child, since we left Alabama, we would always come back in the summer to visit. And there was just a connection, you know, the red clay dirt, and that kind of visual is something I'll always remember. So it's a pleasure to be home.
How long has art been part of your life?
Art has always been a part of my life. And I can remember, like, dating back to when the Beatles came to the States for the first time, 1964. I distinctively remember drawing picture over and over of the Beatles and my favorite Beatles. And so that dates my work till like I was 4 years old at the time. And so I remember back then just drawing the Beatles a lot. So I've been drawing pretty much all my life.
Where did you get your training?
I originally went to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. Originally I was going to be a fine art major, but then started to look realistically at where I want to go in my career and decided to change my major to graphic design and illustration. So I transferred to the American Academy of Art, also in Chicago, where I got my degree in graphic design and illustration with a minor in art history.
Charly, we're surrounded by your art, and we're in the building that houses the Rosa Parks Museum.
Yes. The
Troy University Rosa Parks Museum and Library.
Mm-hmm.
You have an exhibition currently underway, and it will last through January, I believe.
Right.
Your art has a message.
The story that I tell is a story of I believe, the unsung hero. You know, we know of, and I honor Mother Rosa, or Rosa Parks, for her courage, but there's so many that we know very little about. And I'm committed to telling that story. I'm committed to telling the story of my grandparents and how strong and how committed and how loving she was and protective she was of her family. And there's so many stories like that that people can connect with. And so that's what I create. And the last time I was in Montgomery, I visited the Rosa Parks exhibit, which I think is absolutely incredible, one of the best I've seen in the country. But I also had gone to the Civil Rights Museum, and I walked away from that. After doing several years of telling that story, I was starting to move into other subjects. But then after leaving Montgomery the last time, I made a commitment that somehow, some way, I will continue to tell this story for the rest of my life.
What is your commitment to telling this story to young people specifically?
My generation is, I think, the last generation that paid any attention to the civil rights movement and that struggle. The next generation, which are, let's say, the 18 to 20-year-olds or whatever, they occasionally have heard a story here and there, and the next generation after that hear no stories whatsoever. As I was telling someone the other day, it's like when you encounter people that were part of the movement, the ones that I choose to honor, a lot of times they were like survivors of a war and the post-traumatic syndrome of not even wanting to experience or re-experience those stories. But I think part of them not sharing it with their grandchildren and great-grandchildren is, I think there appears to be a lack of interest. And I think that these young people really need to know where these people have come from, and that where they are, where they stand today, they are there because of the courage of these sometimes quiet heroes.
On December 16th at 11 a.m. in the gallery, you will be doing a gallery talk and PowerPoint presentation.
Right.
What's involved in that?
Pretty much, again, telling the story maybe integrating some photographs that were probably very famous and a part of that period of the civil rights movement, as well as showing how I interpreted some of those photographs, and then telling my story, and then also trying to connect the audience of any age to that story and how it affects us today. You know, I think that even if we were to get a little bit political, I didn't expect the emotion that I felt when Obama was elected. I found myself crying, and that surprised me. And then I realized what it was I had this dream, but I never thought it would ever happen in my lifetime. And I never allowed myself to even say that out loud until that moment when I'm looking at my sons that are in their 20s and my brother who's 15 years younger than me, and seeing all these young people celebrating this moment. And I'm like, this is happening right now. I didn't allow myself to really believe it would happen. You know, so I think it's so important that the young people understand that, you know, we've come a long way. And what I say all the time is the struggle isn't over with, but it is time to take a moment to celebrate before we get back to work again.
And you talked about your grandparents, what they went through, and the fact that you had different emotions when you went through the Troy University Rosa Parks Museum.
Right.
How did your feelings change as a result of that experience?
It was more that I really thought for a brief moment that my commitment to telling the story was completed. But then seeing the Rosa Parks exhibit and seeing these amazing parts of history, I just realized it's like this story can be told for the rest of my life and still only scratch the surface.
Did you go through the children's wing and go on the time travel bus?
No, I didn't.
That's an experience. So maybe your next visit can be that.
I need a time travel bus. Yeah. I'd love to see that.
We're surrounded by your art. We have our own art exhibit here for this program. Let's describe your paintings, because I see the graphics, that's your background, reflected in your paintings. So let's talk about them individually.
Okay.
Behind me?
Well, you know, the thing about it though, Carolyn, what I do is only tell part of the story, because I believe that a painting speaks for itself. You know, so what I want to do is to say, this is part of the story. And a lot of times when I'm in an exhibit and someone says, tell me about a piece, I will turn to them and say, you tell me. And a lot of times their story is so much more interesting than mine. You know, but a lot of times I've learned to understand that everything that happens through a painting happens through me. I can honestly say that I can't claim any of this. I acknowledge that a higher power has chosen me, as it's chosen every artist, to express something. So when something happens, it's usually a journey for me. And a lot of times when I create pieces, I have no idea, quite honestly, what they even mean, until somebody comes to me and says, I get it, and they'll tell me their story. And this is honest. There are times when I'm like, aha, I get it. But at first I'm like, I don't know why I'm doing this one. But the piece behind you right here says, God is. And that's an incomplete statement, because, again, it's like you define what God is to you. But the name of the piece is American Aid. And so often what happens to the government, especially when it comes to something outside of the country, but often when it's inside the country, is that we put a Band-Aid on a broken arm. We don't do enough to make a difference. And in the case of this is an area, I'm trying to remember where it was again. I want to say Somalia. It was part of Somalia, or one country. And when I created the piece, I had completed it with the mother and the two children, and it felt incomplete. It seemed like there was something missing from it. And so I went back to the piece, the original piece of reference, and like there's more to the story, because I see these people are in need. And what we're offering here is, again, a Band-Aid. We're wrapping a flag around them to warm them, but there's hunger and there's education and there's all these other needs that are not being provided for. And so that's kind of what that piece is all about.
These are large paintings. What's your medium?
My medium is acrylic. Acrylic on canvas, acrylic on board, acrylic on any kind of surface that can maintain it or hold up. It can hold up on.
Very colorful.
And the colors are spontaneous. Again, it's allowing, I never have any preconceived ideas of what a piece should look like and what colors should be there.
Is there a significance to the color choice?
No, not for me. I mean, it's about, like when I allow an experience to happen to me, I try to remain quiet, simply because I'm painting sometime and Charlie, the person, the human, wants to use certain colors, like let's say natural colors for flesh. And one day I was having a painting once, and the energy came purple and blue. And I'm like, and having this conversation with myself, purple and blue, and then hesitating. And then I'm like, okay, let it be. And so I laid down the color and I looked at it, and it was absolutely beautiful. And I had to say, thank you. And then again, it's like, Charlie, just get out of the way and let the experience happen to you.
Because first and foremost, artists are observers.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about your second painting.
Second painting, it's more about, again, the civil rights movement. You'll see the images in the background, like the Ernest Withers piece from the streets, the sanitation department's protest, which led to actually the assassination of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King and Jesse Jackson, several, Abernathy, and trying to remember who, it may be Hosea Williams, on the banister of the Lorraine motel before he was assassinated, the day before. But a quote by Martin Luther King is used as part of the piece. And then it's just, what I was showing more than anything is the protector, meaning the father, who's there to be an example, to be a hero, to be, you know, the strength and everything that we all seek in our parents.
And then you have worked in a graphics message.
Mm-hmm.
We have guided missiles and misguided men.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that you're using the literary approach as well as the visual, artistic approach in your work.
So you just did it. You just did what I'm talking about. You just brought to my attention something I was totally unaware of. And that's the lesson in understanding that none of this is us. You know, all of this is coming from a source that's greater than us, and if we understand and allow the experience to happen, we'll learn something. And I just learned something.
Which is why the exhibit is entitled, I Remember When, From Whence We've Come.
Mm-hmm.
This is a history lesson.
Yeah.
Are you a historian?
I love history. I've always loved history.
Let's talk about your other two paintings.
This is actually my granddaughter. And they come by to visit one day, my son and my granddaughter, and she had on her little Catholic outfit and everything. I'm like, here, get my camera, I gotta get some pictures. And so I immediately went and started taking pictures without any idea of what I was gonna use it for. And then a lot of people aren't familiar with Dr. Kenneth, Dr. Kenneth, can't remember his full name, did a doll test in 1954, which led to the Brown versus Board of Education. Part of the argument that Marshall used, and it was that when he tested young black children, they discovered that they identified with white dolls more than black dolls because they were embarrassed and not feeling really good about a doll that looked too much like themselves. And it was a tragic kind of acknowledgement that our black children aren't raised with pride for who they are. But I think something that was even more tragic, quite honestly, is discovering in 2006 when they redid the test. It was a young sister in Brooklyn, New York, who did a test just to kind of see how young children today would react, and found out that the results were almost identical to back when that decision and when that first experiment was run.
Charlie, when you extrapolate this on out, not only this child, this grandchild of yours, concerned about that doll, but the self-image of women, of young girls in this culture.
Yes, definitely.
So that's an additional message in this painting. And you also have a graphics message in the painting, 2006, Which Doll Looks Like You?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that Dr. Kenneth, I'm sorry, his name escapes me in this moment, but Dr. Kenneth said that when he interviewed the children and asked them these questions and watched their reaction, he said the most painful question and reaction he had to deal with was the last question he would ask them. And each time it was, after asking him so many questions like, which is a nice doll, which is a pretty doll, and all that, he asked, which doll looks the most like you? And to watch the pain in that black child's face when they had to realize that the child that they thought was ugly or stupid looked the most like them. And so I think that's poignant and powerful. And it is, again, an issue of how do we deal with our children today?
All of your art seems to be about messages. Not only the messages of the past, but in the continuum, the history continuum. What messages are we living today? What messages are we sending out today?
Right. I think it's important. It's like, because in order to know our future, or even to know now, we have to know a lot about our history. And I think the first I heard was Public Enemy say, "Know your history, not his story." You know, and that's so important. It's like you gotta know. So I think that one of the reasons that, like, when children put such a value on material things today is because they fail to understand what we valued many years ago. And like Martin Luther King said, that if you don't have something to live for, you're not fit. I mean, if you don't have something to die for, you're not fit to live. And it sounds like a very powerful statement, but if you think about what we live for today, we've lost completely the sense of what really is valuable. And I think what is valuable are things like family. What is valuable is relationships and love. Those things are valuable. I don't even, like, you look at the work, and the work seems very heavy, very message driven. That's never been my intent. My intent is to be light and fun and just paint. But I'm always driven back to, again, listening to the Spirit, and the Spirit saying, this is what you got to do.
Another thing that speaks to me about your art is the fact that it's educational.
I agree.
Your art is teaching.
I'm learning. Messages.
Let's talk about your last painting to your left.
Okay, that's called Angel Knot. And it's more, everybody can relate to it, because I was one of those kids that was forced to go to church when I was a kid. And so it was very painful. And so I could wear my suit and I could look very good, but I was always up to sneakiness. I was always up to something. You know, I often, like when my mom wouldn't go to church, she would send us to church. And she would always give us like 50 cents a piece to put in the collection box. And a quarter would always end up at the corner store on the way to or from church. And so I think about the angels, and I think what made me really think about this, creating this piece, was when I finally got to a point in my life as an adult, and it took a while, that I found myself back in church and found myself really enjoying church. And now at a point where it was a time when church seemed to drag and be an all-day thing, and all of a sudden it seemed to never be enough time. And so I think about those little sweet innocent faces of the little children that don't get it yet, but maybe that whole initial introduction to church is what will eventually lead them back to church.
Is this a portrait of you at that age?
That's a portrait of my nephew. And again, that nephew photograph came from my sister sending some photographs. And I just thought he looked so beautiful. And so I actually flew up to Wisconsin and went and bought him a jacket and a tie and took a series of photographs. I had no idea, again, how I was going to use it. It's just that I thought his face was so beautiful that I knew I wanted to paint him somehow.
Another thing I notice about at least a couple of these paintings is that there is attention paid to the ears.
Huh?
So
my dad brought that to my attention.
Not only are we getting a visual message, but we're also wondering what messages these people, these subjects in your paintings are hearing from their culture.
Mm-hmm. Someone brought that to my attention once. My dad was the first to say, "Why are you doing the big ears?" And I'm like, I don't know, I've always loved ears. I've always loved hands, and I've always loved ears. And so it's not intentional, but I think there is a message there.
Finally, 1956, Rosa Parks, what is this, her jail number?
Yeah, right, when she was arrested for refusing to move on the seat when she was, you know, I'm trying to remember, it's like right on the corner here of Lee Street and Montgomery or something like that. But after visiting the last time I was in Montgomery and going through the tour, I just went back to my studio and said, I have to do at least one piece that honors her. And what had happened was it was a whole another direction I was going with how I was presenting the work. It was no longer on canvas. And so I started to assemble it, and it's a lot of spontaneity there. I know that the centerpiece would be Rosa, and the rest would be whatever I collected. And so when I created it, and I knew it was going to happen, it was just, again, watching it evolve and wondering how it was going to, you know, fulfill itself in the end. And so that's the story.
Charlie, what you've captured with this picture of Rosa Parks is the Rosa Parks who didn't know what would happen next. You know, when you look in the Rosa Parks Museum at the bust, the sculpture of her, she's that wise, all-knowing Rosa Parks. This is the Rosa Parks who didn't know what tomorrow would bring.
Right.
And you've captured that.
But isn't that most heroes? Most heroes are not ones that intentionally try to be heroes. They are the ones that stood up when asked, you know, and had no idea how it would reflect or affect the future. You know, I don't think there are any intentional heroes out there. But I think that's the lesson again, and young people just honoring our elders. You know, knowing you don't know what shoes they've walked in, what experiences they've had, and that's why I really would encourage young people, sit down and talk to your grandparents, and you will discover some amazing things.
You have a freshness about your art that jumps out and speaks to people with a new message. People who have known civil rights history and lived it, but these have a freshness about them. So I hope that you're very proud of capturing that.
I'm proud. I'll take some credit. I really will. I'll take some credit, but for the most part, a lot of things that happen is bringing something to life that probably is, again, is coming through me. So the story is easily told when I learn to get out of the way and let the story be told.
How many pieces are we talking about in your exhibit, which lasts through January 28th?
There will be a total of 38 pieces, including, I mean, subject matters will be like the 4 little girls that lost their lives in Birmingham, Alabama. The civil rights movement. There's a series of pieces that are focusing on the doll test. There's a piece that is a tribute to Martin Luther King. It's a nice variety of things stories that are being told.
So as you continue to experience places like the Troy University Rosa Parks Museum, I take it you will continue to reinterpret these experiences in your art.
Right, definitely. I would say I went, this summer was the 45th year of the killing of the civil rights workers in it was at Mississippi. What part of Mississippi? I can't remember right now. Philadelphia, Mississippi, I'm sorry. And it was disheartening to see how few people showed up to march and to honor these and so many other young men and women that lost their lives, that sometimes either never went to trial or were dismissed once they went to trial. Because rarely has anybody been persecuted for or prosecuted for any of those cases. But it's telling that story. It's telling, you know, when you think about, you know, Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney, these young men that had so much to live for, but also had something that they were willing to die for, and did in this case. It's like, you know, I gotta do something. And so I know that as long as I travel the South, and sometimes even the North, something will inspire or light or ignite a need to tell another story.
Do you have a website?
Yes, actually it's charlypalmer.com, Charlie with a Y, C-H-A-R-L-Y, Palmer.com.
So that people can check out your art online.
Right.
And then, of course, see it in person here at the Troy University Rosa Parks Museum. And for details on all of that, you can go to the Troy website, which is www.troy.edu, and find out more information. Charlie, I want to thank you for being our guest today.
It's a pleasure.
Charly Palmer is the distinguished artist from Atlanta with roots in Alabama, and he's been our guest today on the program. And thank you for joining us. And I know you'll be looking forward, as we are, to seeing your exhibit in the Troy University Rosa Parks Museum through January 28th.